Good evening. This is the seventh part of a series entitled The Woman with 1.5 Hands. It should not be viewed before you've had a go at all six of the previous installments, and in order, which is to say, first one, then two, then three, etc. To consume this product in a bric-a-brac fashion is ill-advised. I'm serious. You'll get lost. That said, here's part 7, or On Cognitive Dissonance. In an academic discussion or confrontation, the time to reach for the term cognitive dissonance is debatable. For those who hurl this dispersion early and often, the results are predictable, and it almost always involves a mirror, i.e., what psychologists call projection. Too late, though. In other words, if the conversation starts to get heated, and she says you're suffering from cognitive dissonance before you deem it appropriate to say the same thing about her, and, well, your goose just might be cooked. That said, I have found it enervating to try to pinpoint where exactly cognitive dissonance fits into this discussion. Tried to recharge my batteries within the sanctuary of some William Faulkner, but instead discovered the work of one Nancy Faulkner, Ph.D. Dr. Faulkner received her doctorate in counseling psychology, and her areas of expertise include substance abuse, communication, victimization, parenting, and more. Perused some of her work, including a piece called Why Women Stay, which I'll soon excerpt, as Dr. Faulkner professionally portrays in it an excellent example of what cognitive dissonance is all about. Here's a preview of that excerpt. Quote, "To explain further, if a spaceship landed in your front yard, the door opened and funny little green people came out, you might be frightened. What if I assured you, though, that these were very friendly people, that they would take you to live on another planet in a stress-free paradise, but you could never return to what you now know as life on Earth? Would you go with these aliens?" End quote. We'll get back to her question, but first it's important to note that what I'm doing here is quoting somebody out of context in a non-malicious way. She brings up aliens, I bring up aliens. No malice. Which is to say, I think the only way to settle the issue of who's getting their cognitive dissonance on and who isn't would be to enlist the help of a being or beings from out of this world. It or they would have to reproduce in a completely different way from how we humans manage that feat to eliminate possible biases, and it would have to be brought up to speed about life on Earth and how we humans usually operate and interact with each other in a variety of situations. Then, both sides, those who are members of TerraCo, or the anti-rape industrial complex, and those who want to end rape but aren't members of TerraCo, would be given equal time to make their case. Then, after listening to both sides, if this extraterrestrial didn't quickly lower its antenna, hop back into its spaceship, and blast off immediately, and if it instead chose to get involved, it might be able to help us understand how the following numbers could possibly be referring to the same activity, and yet diverge so astronomically. Jaden and Tone estimated that 876,064 rapes happened in the U.S. in a year preceding their NVAW survey. But then approximately 14 years later, and with the U.S. population having grown by more than 43 million people, the FBI estimated that the number of rapes in America in 2010 was 84,767. Has the rape rate really fallen that precipitously? It's now less than a tenth of the rate it was in the mid-90s? Let's break it down. Similarities? Both tabulated occurrences for the entire U.S. and the U.S. only. Both spanned consecutive 12-month time periods only, and both attached the label of rape to all attempted rapes and all completed rapes. Differences? The FBI excluded non-forcible statutory rapes, but counted all forcible rapes of all females, not just those over 18. Though they calculated rapes of minors in some of their other matrices, Jane and Tone interviewed women over the age of 18 only, and their 876,000 and some change number refers to rapes that occurred within 12 months prior to each phone call, calls that were placed between November 1995 and May 1996. Okay, so we have a large gap, perhaps unbelievably so, between numbers counted by two different agencies at two different times. In some ways they counted alike, and in other ways they counted differently. In the following, I hypothesize that we can augment their numbers with estimates calculated by, for instance, Howard Snyder and Melissa Sickman in their 2006 report on juvenile victims, among others. And that after this augmentation, if my math is correct, we should be able to better count and more accurately compare all rapes in the mid-90s to all rapes in 2010. But there's still the issue of direction or focus. Which way are we going to go with this? Where are we going to look for answers? In other words, just because the FBI's number is so much smaller than Jaden and Tone's number, does that mean that the only logical way to address it is to search for ways to show that those in law enforcement undercounted rapes? Not necessarily. Common sense would step up to the plate at this juncture, and those of you who have viewed part 2 of this series know how I feel about common sense. Yes, common sense would first hawk another loogie into that nearby spittoon, and then say that we should try to decrease the gap, either by decreasing Jaden and Tone's big number or by increasing the FBI's small number, or do both. Scientific method doesn't work that way, though. A lab assistant approaching this problem for the first time should know that that gap might be too big, or too small, or just right. And that assistant would then, after sterilizing all of his or her petri dishes, run all of the following trial and error experiments. Experiments that would reveal Jaden and Tone's number to be either too big, too small, or just right along with experiments that would show the FBI's number to be too big, too small, or just right. Science says look for all the ways it might be. Common sense says look for ways to show that that gap's not that big. Terraco brass say shrink the gap, but only by increasing the FBI's little tiny number. A way that common sense and science, in this instance, just might be on the same team, or the same page anyway, has to do with inertia, well, or how we think inertia works. Say your car's rolling down the road and the engine cuts out. Science and common sense agree that your car's going to keep rolling for a while, due to its inertia. Rape, though, being a human interaction, isn't subject to the same physical laws as inanimate objects are. Even so, we expect rape rates to stay about the same. Maybe they'll go up a little or down a little, but for the most part, they'll stay about the same because it seems as though they have a sort of inertia to them. Groups of people don't usually drastically change how they behave overnight, unless there's a good reason. So, are we at a point of impasse? No. There's plenty we can do at this point. Consider the Department of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey of 2006 to 2010 has it that rape has decreased by 60% since 1993. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Cooperation, to a certain extent. And it seems like a more reasonable decrease. Thing is, other violent crimes during this same time span have also seen their numbers fall, some even quite dramatically. So it's not like we need to look for ways to completely close the gap between Jaden and Tone's mid-90s estimates and the FBI's 2010 estimates. Gap's been confirmed, rape's gone down, along with plenty other similar crimes, so it's probably a trend. But what about reportage? Rape is said to be one of our most underreported crimes. This I get into quite in depth in part 8 of this series, and in another upcoming video in this series subtitled Reaching Out versus Being Reached. So anyway, I think science would have us try to cover all the bases. I'm going to try to, but I'm going to save some of the more unlikely possibilities for the notes at the end. Here, in this video, I'm going to focus on ways that show that while rape has decreased lately, it has probably decreased at less than a 10-to-1 clip. First up, let's re-examine how the FBI totals what it calls rape, starting with its most glaring omission, non-forcible statutory rape. The FBI doesn't tally instances from this subcategory of rape right alongside crimes like murder, robbery, aggravated assault, larceny, theft, and crimes against property. Why not? Does the FBI think it's not violent, or that it's not really a crime? I'm of the opinion, maybe others are with me on this, that the FBI would do well to reconsider its nomenclature for the following. A non-forcible statutory rape where, say, a 45-year-old man who, with candy and promises of trips to Disney World, ends up wooing into bed some 15-year-old girl with the mental acumen of a 9-year-old. I think this should be considered a bona fide rape, despite the fact that both were smiling while sitting next to each other on the roller coaster while it slowly clacked upward. Now, admittedly, many of America's non-forcible statutory rapes are not of this February-October variety, and it should be noted that a number of these Romeo and couples are still married to each other decades later when he's 40 and she's 36, and their age difference really isn't that big of a deal. Either which way, though, it seems law enforcement could do better than to lump all non-forcible statutory rapes in the same category, only to later basically archive them, in effect brushing aside a sizable chunk of overall rapes. How sizable, though? Is there a way to estimate the number of statutory rapes the FBI excludes? Well, there are at least two ways. We can augment with numbers calculated by Snyder and Sickmund, or we can borrow from Jaden and Tone's estimations, which I'll do first. Although Jaden and Tone didn't survey those under 18, they did perhaps include victims that the FBI excluded from the number one year of life victimization age group, namely 17-year-olds. This would have happened if any of those on the phone who were 18 had been raped in a statutory way only, i.e. without force, because they were newly 18 and they'd willingly copulated with someone over the age of 18 when they were still 17. But it's simply not likely that anywhere near the extrapolated number needed, about 791,297 non-forcible statutory rapes, would have been referenced during their 8,000 phone calls. Also, for this hypothetical to be possible, it would presuppose that no females under age 17 have been statutorily raped without force. Of course, many were, and Snyder and Sickman give us a much clearer picture of those numbers, which I'll get to in a jiff. But back to my example. If we added a proposed estimate of rapes overlooked by the FBI to those they didn't overlook, 791,297 plus 84,767, we'd get Jaden and Tone's extrapolated number, 876,064. But, according to the FBI and other sources, since all statutory rapes, both with and without force, make up from 15 to 17% of all rapes, and since 791,297 is a little over 90% of 876,064, it makes little sense to think that in this instance, non-forcible statutory rape would ring up anywhere near 90%, when most of the time it rings up as a fraction of 16%. For this number to be legit, for the FBI to have really left off that many rapes by its not counting non-forcible rapes of minors as rape, 21 or 22 of the 24 recently raped women that Jaden and Tone surveyed would have had to have been over the age of 18 during that call, but had only recently turned 18, had willingly had sex with an adult during the previous 12 months and before turning 18, all of which would make them victims of non-forcible statutory rape. The FBI would not count these 21 or 22 illegal trysts as rapes, but Jaden and Tone would. Auguring against the likelihood that 21 or 22 such interviews actually took place is the extreme probability that Jaden and Tone randomly sampled. I take them at their word when they wrote that they called a variety of ages over the age of 18. Point in fact, they do show sound sampling behavior via the following demographical apportioning. Over 1,500 women who were between 18 and 29 years old were asked questions about rape. Over 1,900 women who were between 30 and 39 were asked these same questions, and so on and so forth, each of their 5 age when surveyed demographical categories averaging 1,600 participants. But even though they mentioned that 341 of the 1,524 18 to 29-year-old women they interviewed said that at some time in their life they'd been raped. Unfortunately, Jane and Tone didn't mention how many of these 341 women had been raped in the 12 months prior to their interview, let alone if and how many were barely 18, had just turned 18, had willingly had sex with someone over the age of 18 while they were still 17, etc., etc. Ergo, it's possible, highly unlikely, but it's possible that 21 or 22 of the 341 18 to 29-year-old female rape victims had just turned 18 and had been victimized in what the FBI would classify as a non-forcible statutory rape in the previous 12 months. But if that were the case, it would also mean that only 2 or 3 women over the age of 30 would have been raped in the year prior to their interview. Question: after surveying 6,476 women over the age of 30, and after hearing that 1,088 of them had been raped at some point in their life, is it very likely that only 2 or 3 of them had been raped in the previous year? Sure, rape is largely a crime perpetrated against the young, and if you're under 30 while you're being raped, that places you squarely in the 80 percentile group. That logically also means, though, that 20% of all women who are raped when they're over 30. If Jane and Tone's numbers lined up proportionately, or close enough, with national averages, then it follows that they would have called 5 recently raped female victims who were over 30, and they would have called 19 recently raped female victims who were under 30. With such small numbers, though, it's important to note that all 24 could have come from any one of their 5 age groups, even from their over 60 age group. Why this is possible is because 103 of these elderly women told interviewers that they'd been raped at some time in their life. And 103 is more than 24, which I imagine is the reason, or one of the reasons, why Jane and Tone told readers that, quote, because our rape estimates are based on responses from only 24 women who reported being raped in the 12 months preceding the survey, the data are unstable and should be viewed with caution, end quote. Indeed. And here I am calculating mathematical refractions, if you will, of very liquid, if not imaginary, estimates of estimates, when none of that can be done with any kind of certainty. Talk about rigor. Okay, so is it time for a little agonizing reappraisal? No. Did I go wrong again? And if so, how? Yes, I went wrong, and by assuming. By assuming Jane and Tone were completely flouting good sampling behavior, and, while phoning, they kept reaching interviewee after interviewee who was either 1, a woman over the age of 19 who had never been raped, or 2, a female rape victim who had recently turned 18, but her only rape had been a non-forcible statutory rape in the previous year. And so these researchers got tired of again and again failing to find victims who fit their existing model, and though they feared for future lost grant monies, and they swore they weren't going to include in their findings yet another 18-year-old female who, just days before her 18th birthday, had fallen in love with some smooth-talking 24-year-old, and goodness, heavens to Betsy, we all know that contrivance didn't happen. Okay, wrong. We'll go with wrong. But how wrong was I? My intention was, and still is, by the way, to get closer to the truth regarding rape prevalence. Given that 25 to 50% of the women I saw indoors at Walmarts in the mid-90s carried and/or shook their keys, and given that at least that many, but often as high as 60 and 70% of them continue to exhibit this same rape awareness behavior, viz. Their keys, inside Walmarts, I've continued to conduct research at in the last few years, and given that there are over 43 million more Americans now, given those 3 givens, I'm going to hypothesize that in the last 14 or so years, rape rates have not fallen from over 876,000 victimizations per year to under 85,000 similar victimizations in 2010. Granted, there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between conceptions of rape rates and key-shaking behavior, and perhaps the latter merely follows the ebbing and flowing of the former, and there is a delay. And granted that rape is most definitely a different animal than fear of rape, And granted that key-shaking behavior is not always a direct result of a woman actually fearing that she's about to be raped, granted all of that, I would still hypothesize that an increase in key-shaking behavior is not an indicator that rape's gone down over 90%. Rather, as mentioned earlier, I'd argue that it hasn't decreased nearly that much. Moreover, if someone told me that upwards of 1 million American women have been raped in 2010, I wouldn't question that figure, at least not right away. Is this because I'm a pessimist? No, and I'm not. Rather, it's because there are other fish to fry, so to speak, and at first glance, these other fish might seem more worthy of my attention. What I'm seeing is rape rates that kept pace with population increases is not going to make me do a double take. But show me such a radical drop, literally a decimation of the numbers, i.e. moving the decimal point over one spot to the left, and I want an explanation. And I ask how it could possibly be. Doubt starts creeping in. I start reaching for terms like cognitive and dissonance and cognitive dissonance. Anyway, all I was trying to do, and I realize now the error of my ways, was to see if I could expand the FBI's number so it would be more in line with Jane and Tone's number. And what's missing from the FBI's number? Non-forcible statutory rapes, which there are plenty of, and Jane and Tone were only able to catch a few of them, those who were newly 18. If they were allowed to survey those over the age of, say, 10, I'm sure many more would have come forward and told of being non-forcibly statutorily raped at ages between 9 and 17. So, in the last 5 or so minutes of this video, I was trying to partially crunch some numbers, but just enough to show that they can't really be crunched very much at all and remain meaningful. Not an exercise in futility, though. Purpose? To show how, if given incomplete numbers, one might go about estimating what a more complete statistical picture might look like. Howard Snyder and Nancy Sickman, however, can give us a more complete picture, but not without their own limitations, as you'll soon see. In other words, by adjusting the FBI's numbers with help from extrapolations from Jane and Tone, at least there was the potential that a big chunk of numbers could be added to the FBI's numbers without lowering Jane and Tone's estimates. Potential, yes, but as you just heard, not very probable at all. Adjusting estimated rapes in a way that Snyder and Sickman wouldn't mind, on the other hand, does paint a clearer picture of real rape rates, and it can help us conceptualize a decrease in the size of the gap separating Jane and Tone's estimates from the FBI's estimates. Alas, this decrease is not as big as one would hope for. Still, though, exploring with Snyder and Sickman's numbers gets us going in the right direction, and with concrete estimations instead of imaginary refractions of estimations. So it's worth the trip. Snyder and Sickman examined victim and offender characteristics gathered from the FBI's National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS, for the years 1996 through 2000, and then published their findings in the Juvenile Offenders and Victims 2006 National Report. For starters, they randomly sampled from the NIBRS, and then counted the number of non-forcible statutory rapes and the number of forcible statutory rapes. During these 5 years, 25% of the statutory rapes were non-forcible, and 75% were forcible. Quote, if this ratio holds nationally, Snyder and Sickman wrote, then an estimated 15,700 statutory rapes were reported to law enforcement in 2000. End quote. Now, since the FBI doesn't include non-forcible statutory rapes in its rape totals, we can do it for them. The Bureau said that 90,178 forcible rapes of all females happened in 2000. If 1 in 4 statutory rapes was not part of this 90,178, and all statutory rapes accounted for 15,700 of all rapes in 2000, then if we add 1/4 of 15,700 to the 90,178 forcible rapes of all females, it should leave us with all rapes of all females in 2000, whether forcible or non-forcible, whether statutory or otherwise, and whether completed or otherwise. 1/4 of 15,700 is 3,925. So 94,103 females were victimized by rape in some form or another in 2000. We now have both percentages needed to measure non-forcible statutory rapes that occurred in other years, which is to say, since 15,700 is 16.69% of 94,103, we can now measure other years' ratios of forcible to non-forcible statutory rapes. Others list statutory rape as a percentage of all rapes at 15%, further referenced in my notes. To measure them, if all statutory rapes, both those with and without force, comprise 16.69% of all rapes, and if that percentage holds for statistics the FBI compiled for 2010, then if we add non-forcible statutory rapes to the number of rapes the FBI did count that year, a new total of 88,458 emerges. How can that be? 16.69% of 88,458 is 14,764. 25% of 14,764 is 3,691. Subtract 3,691 from 88,458 and we're left with the FBI's original number, 84,767. Therefore, if we added non-forcible statutory rapes to the FBI's number, and if 2000's percentages are reasonably close to what happened in 2010, which is about 16.69% of all rapes were statutory, and about 3/4 of all statutory rapes were forcible, and if the FBI counted all of these rapes in their 2010 figure, we could then say that 88,458 rapes happened in 2010, which is still a far cry from 876,064 rapes, with some saying too far of a cry, myself included. So far I've tried two ways to shrink the gap, both involving making the FBI's rape estimates fall more in line with the reality set forth by academic researchers like Jaden and Tone. Gap still too wide. Either rape really has decreased tremendously, despite the increasingly prevalent visual and auditory secondary or residual evidence at certain supermarkets to the contrary, or maybe there's a third way to go, a way that more plausibly examines how rape is on the decline, but not by numbers even approaching 90%. And it involves these numbers, 100 million, 24, and 8,000. Suppose that 24 out of 8,000 women have been raped in a given year. If his or her sampling procedures are sound, a social scientist would extrapolate thusly. 24 out of 8,000 is the same as 300,000 out of 100 million. And what's that 100 million all about? It's approximately the number of U.S. females over the age of 18 in 1995 who were alive. More exactly, it was 100,697,000 and some change, reasonably and slightly rounded down here to keep the math simple. Okay, so about 300,000 rapes happened every year in America in the mid-90s. Wrong. Around 300,000 women were raped in that same time frame. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. 300,000 is not 876,064. If 24 women said they'd been raped in the year prior to Jaden and Tone ringing them up, and they called 8,000 women during their NVAW survey, and after a scientifically sound extrapolation, they got the maths right, and if I got the maths right, after all that math and science, they said there were 876,064 rapes, but that only a few more than 300,000 women have been raped in any one consecutive 12-month time span in the mid-90s, then, let me see here, 302,091, 302,091 is their exact estimated number. That's Jaden and Tone's exact figure. 302,091 women were raped in any one year in the mid-90s. But there were 876,064 rapes per year during that same time frame. Something's not adding up here. Well, okay, that's it. Probably going to maybe have to do a little truncating right about here. Yep, this just might be the end of the 7th installment of The Woman with 1.5 Hands. We'll have to save the rest of this for part 8. which I'm going to call more on cognitive dissonance.